Hello, I'm teaching artist Alex Rowe. Welcome to the live stream. I'm joined this evening with, of course, Professor Lieu and fellow teaching artist Kat Huang. And today we're going to be discussing highlights in art and their importance. Now, if you have a desire to make healthy studio habits, we have all the resources you need at artprof.org. Our site is completely free. We have tutorials, critiques, professional development, the works. Now, as far as highlights are concerned, Clara, why are highlights important?
I think highlights are one of the parts of an image that typically tend to pop. You tend to notice them pretty fast, usually sooner than you'll notice a shadow. And I also think in terms of value, highlights are very important. We've done a stream about value. So Kat, do you want to elaborate?
Oh my gosh.
Oh,
Elaborate a little bit more about the elements
Yeah.
of art, value. So usually when you have value, you have different scales of the value, as you can see in this stream. So usually we have the darkest parts of the piece and also the lightest parts of the piece. And it's very important in value to differentiate between these differences. You don't need the extremes of both, but the important thing is that it is there, that you have some sort of differentiation of value in your piece.
So this is a series called the Kitchen Table series. It's by the photographer Carrie Mae Weems. And it's just a great series visually and content-wise to talk about highlights. Because in every single photo, there's a scene that revolves around the kitchen table. And there's this one light that comes in from above. So Alex, why does that light become such an important feature visually and in terms of story?
Visually, it's a simple way to make the composition because it's always the brightest point. Always, and then the whole composition can be based around it. Narratively, it does a cool thing where the light essentially becomes a character. And we'll see this a lot, especially in older Renaissance art, where the light is meant to represent something more, typically holy or angelic. But here, yeah, the light is an additional character representing that room.
I also think it's important in a lot of these images to say, do you see the actual light source? Because if we go to this slide, you don't really see the whole lamp. You just see a little sliver of it. But then in this one, you see the whole lamp. So Kat, how does that change our perception of the light?
Well, in some cases, you see the direct source, like in this image, and in other places, you have to sort of guess where the light is coming from. And based on the highlights, that is when you can see where the light is coming from exactly. So you can play around with light. You can have the light in the middle of the piece, such as here. You can show the light source, or you can have the light source not really be obvious, but be shown through value and highlight.
Yeah, like
Oh,
this
gosh,
piece
Clara.
is such a good example where you have that direct light source shining in, and then using a value scale structured throughout the image, it guides the viewer's eye throughout the piece.
Right.
And also, yeah, continue. Yeah.
I really wanted to highlight what you said, Alex, about the light being a character, because I feel like that's a really poignant thing to say, especially in this series, because the light is a constant. It's always there, but the mood changes from piece to piece, depending on the other subject matters, depending on how it is highlighted in the piece. It's really a character interacting with everything else around it.
So we're going to talk about lighting, not just in terms of the way lighting looks, but also lighting in terms of storytelling, setting a mood, becoming part of the scene, because we talked to you guys a lot about these technical things like value and texture and everything, but there's so much more than just what things look like. And that's the way we want you guys to begin to think about lighting. Let's talk about how to identify highlights, because my feeling is that if you can't identify something in real life, you're not going to be able to draw it. So it starts there. For example, what we're mostly going to be talking about in this stream is direct light, and we just have this very simple photo of the sphere pointing at direct light. So Kat, how would you explain what direct light is?
Direct light is basically the light source is shining directly on the subject. So you can see it's very obvious. It's usually the brightest part of that subject. So in this case, on the sphere, it is that dot of light. That light is shining directly on the object. And we're going to see a bunch of other different kinds of direct lights as well, such as when it highlights this body, the direct light is, of course, the brightest part of the body. But highlights aren't just direct light. Highlights can also be diffused and also more subtle in ways that we will show in the next examples.
So for example, in this image, we're showing a highlight that's a lot harsher. So Alex, can you explain why sometimes a highlight might be very dramatic and very abrupt? Like this section, the fold, it goes like highlight shadow, like there's no transition. So why is it so harsh?
Yeah, it can be for a couple reasons. In this case, the way the fold is made, there's only that sliver of it that is getting light, and the rest of it is directly in shadow. So, of course, it is going to be a clean-cut edge. The harshness could also come from, I can't help but think of a joke story with like a shiny surface, say like a metal kettle or something, where the light is hitting it. That will be a very abrupt light. Or if like skin is wet or shiny or oily, then the highlight will be brighter.
Or if you spend your afternoon hanging out in a chicken coop, like I did a couple of weeks ago, and there's bright, direct sunlight right on top of the chicken, sometimes it's so bright that the highlight almost gets blown out. Like you almost can't even see the form that's in there. And so that's what we're talking about in terms of direct sunlight. Now, Kat, why are the highlights in this image softer and slower to transition into shadow?
You know, I think it has to do also in this case with the texture of the cloth and what kind of cloth it is, because in the harsh light version of the cloth, that's a metallic silk kind of cloth. But in the soft highlights cloth, that one is more like a cotton sort of texture cloth. So I think it also depends on the material. And Alex brought up a great example with the metal kettle. But anyways, with this soft highlights example, I also think it depends on where it is situated in the light. So the harsh version is sort of like backlit, but in this cloth, this soft highlight cloth, it is more in the sunlight, and the transition from shadow to light is not as dramatic because more of it is in light.
One thing you guys can think about when you're looking at a highlight is ask yourself, what direction is the light coming from? Because this red cloth, the light is coming from above. It's coming straight down, whereas as Kat said earlier, the cloth at the bottom, it's more backlit. So you really have to say, where is it coming from? From the side, from above, from below. Lisa H says, soft highlights are challenging to draw. Why do you think that is, Alex?
Oh, absolutely. I think, well, the dramatic highlights are so much easier and more fun because it's like then that splash of highlight against the shadow, and it just is so yummy and satisfying to paint or draw. Soft highlights are difficult because then you're getting into that whole value scale and you're trying to balance, okay, so this is still a lit part of this fabric, but it's a dark fabric. How does this compare with the rest of the image? So at least for me, that's why it's so challenging to draw, is getting the accurate value in place with the rest of the composition. How about you, Kat? What about you?
I totally agree with what you said, Alex. I also think it might be like the transition from light to dark. When it's so contrasted and it's so obvious, you're like, yep, I can do that. But then when it's more of a gradient, I think it's a lot harder to execute, just technically speaking.
Hopefully I'm back. Sorry, I keep having internet issues. Anyway, if I disappear for a second, I will try my best to come back. We have a question from DustyGit. I often can't imagine how the highlights would be on some subjects without looking onto the real things. Any tips for that? Kat, what do you think?
Well, Destigate channel, I think you're doing the right thing by looking at the real objects, because I would do exactly that as well. If I didn't know how light shined on a metal kettle, I would look at a metal kettle, right, in real life. And then actually, we have a really great stream on our prof about how to take your own reference photos and how to use references. So, you don't have to imagine everything from just your head. You can take inspiration from everything around you, and that includes reference materials. So I would just continue what you're doing. Just look at real things.
John Murph says, how do you tackle highlights from real sunlight instead of pictures as it fades? Alex.
That's really interesting. And in a way, I'd piggyback off of Kat's answer of get all the photo references you can, learn how light works. Then you could have an understanding, even if you're determined to draw from memory and imagination, that base knowledge and reality is what will fuel it. So yeah, I would say all of the reference photos you can to understand how that fading would work.
Another thing to know is that if you guys get a window that's facing north, that is very soft, consistent light that you will pretty much have throughout the daytime. Now, if it's south-facing light, that's the light that's going to drive you insane because it's like changing every 10 minutes and stuff like that. So basically, if you want to work from light, from natural light, from a window, you have to find a window that has very soft, diffused lighting. It's that like bright, direct sunlight that's going to change on you and be very difficult to do. Okay, let's talk about surfaces, because the type of surface that the highlight is falling on really determines what the highlight looks like. So for example, we have this chili pepper here that's dried out. Kat, why are the highlights so crisp and well articulated here? They're not soft at all.
It has to do with the texture of the object. Look at how it's a smooth skin, but it's crinkly. So depending on the texture, the highlight will fall on that object differently. Now, imagine if this was a piece of silk. The highlights would be diffused and softer and completely different. So I think it really depends on the texture of the object.
So apparently popes used to wear chili pepper outfits back in Velasquez's time. Does this look just like the chili pepper, Alex?
It's like uncanny.
I didn't even do this on purpose.
Yeah, we didn't realize until we put the slides together. It's like, wait a minute. But yeah,
so what does this tell you about the Pope's outfit, Alex, based on the highlight?
From the highlight, and in a way, the outfit tells you everything, where beneath it with the very frilly kind of cotton white, that very soft highlight against this shiny silken velvet. Like, that's incredible. And even in your all's own wardrobe, you can see like the shine of leather versus cotton versus silk versus all of those different fabrics will have a different reaction to the light.
Slepnir is asking, isn't there a bit of a disconnect from a photo and the real world? There's so much nuance in reality versus a photo. Kat, what's your take on that?
Absolutely, there is a disconnect from photo and the real world. But I think photos are such a great tool for reference, and you would be remiss to not use it. So for instance, if you do want to capture sunlight coming through a window at sunset, you can't just sit through hundreds of sunsets and then have your painting be done. That's like hundreds of days that you have to sit through. What if you need to get a sunset picture done in like a week? You're going to have to take reference photos in that case. But I would still suggest that you sit through a real sunset just to, like, as you said, soak in all the nuances, soak in all the details of the actual situation, but also take reference photos.
I think you have to do both. I think that, like Kat said, photos are so convenient. I mean, not everybody can be like Monet, and have a studio apartment across the street from Rouen Cathedral so we could do all these different paintings with different lighting situations. But if you only look at photos, you're going to miss a lot of nuances, not just in terms of lighting, but in terms of color, because the color I find in photographs is not nearly as good as what you might find in real life. And there are ways you can do it. For example, this is an Ang painting. And if I were doing a portrait like this, I would get the dress and put it on a mannequin and paint it from life. So there are ways you can work around not being able to have a perfect photo or the best lighting situation. That's another workaround. Now, what about this one, Alex? This is not fabric. It's not a chili bear. What's going on here?
This is a shiny surface. It reminds me of a funny story I wanted to bring up earlier, where I did a self-portrait in class in pencil drawing back in art school, and I had all of these highlights over, and the professor said, those highlights are way too bright. This person must have very oily skin. And I felt attacked. So that's why it's when the surface has a little bit of moistness or dampness, either from oil or water or anything like that, it will have that shine to it despite being a skin-like texture.
This is a really weird form because it's not crinkly like the pepper, but it does have texture, but it's also got sheen and it is sort of skin-like. So it's like every surface requires a custom job in terms of lighting. Now, I know because I shot a photo of this fish in my bathroom. My bathroom is my photo shoot place because it has really nice natural light, but you can see the light is very cool and it's pretty soft, like the highlights very spread out. And so that definitely is a signal that it's light coming from a window because only natural light will spread itself out that much. Now, Kat, how about this Sargent painting? What's going on here in terms of how he's handling the highlight on the dress?
Oh my gosh, it's so luscious. So clearly this sort of fabric is some sort of gossamer fabric. I really like the word gossamer. But anyways, you can tell by how dramatic he puts on the paint on that fabric, what material it is, and also its translucency. It's shiny, yes, but you know what? It's also see-through. So how does this react in comparison to the silkiness of her dress? Because that's also a silky material, but it's already very different from the gossamer sleeve, right? So as Clara said, really every highlight needs to be curated for that particular situation, lighting situation, and also texture of the item.
Angie says, I love how you can see everything in the shadows when drawing from life. Shadows are challenging in photos because everything is erased. That's so true. I was doing that paint along stream, the purple and yellow still life, and there are some areas in that photo that are in shadow. It's just flat black. There is just nothing there. And I have to just make something up because I know in real life it's not that flat black. I know that there's something emerging out of that darkness. And that's one of the reasons I just get so bothered painting from a photo because I know that I'm missing a lot of information. What's going on here, Alex? Why are we not getting that stark, really clear-cut highlight?
It's really tricky, especially if you have or will paint animal or pet portraits, that the highlights just do not shine just as bright on soft surfaces like pet hair or certain fabrics. And what's happening is the light is essentially getting diffused through all of the tiny hairs and follicles. So it's not as shiny and punchy, it's more muted throughout.
By the way, this is Wheat. This is my really large guinea pig. When we got him, he was so small, and now he's bigger than the other two combined. So I don't know, maybe it's the acreage of his body or something is taking over. Natalie says, do objects always have reflected light visible? It's hard for me to tell if a lighter patch of value is reflected light off some surface or just the local color or perhaps a form shadow variation. What do you think, Kat?
Oh my gosh, that's a faceted question. So I think everything has the ability to reflect light. So I would take that into account. But that being said, not all objects show reflected light that obviously. So take wheat, for example, previously. We had that direct sort of soft surface highlight. And I'm sure that wheat can also reflect light. But in this case, if you were to draw wheat, you can't make the reflected light so obvious. You would just have a little bit on wheat's chin, for instance, because I know that is reflected light, right? And so you have to be really careful about the object you're portraying. Is it I'm going to bring it up again, metal kettle. Is it a metal kettle? In which case the reflected light would be much stronger than, say, if it were on wheat. I hope that answered the question.
You know what I do sometimes if I really am like struggling with reflected light? I'll just take a piece of paper and I'll put it next to an object. Like, let's say, for example, I'm painting this orange, okay? And I'm having trouble seeing the reflected light. I'll take a piece of white paper, put it up against the object, and that will create reflected light that is brighter than usual. And then I know, oh, okay, that is a reflected light. That's not just a color that's bouncing off something else. That's why if you watch like a photography shoot, you'll notice they always have these huge reflectors that they put on people. It's to make sure that the shadows don't fall too flat and you can see the form better. Now, sometimes the highlights really show off the texture. Like, Alex, what does this highlight tell you about the surface of this orange?
That highlight is defining everything about it, because when you look at the midtones, it's very subtle, that kind of stippling, there's a word for it, with the holes within the texture, whereas the highlight really makes it come alive and fills the rest of the image in for our brain. So highlights can be so important for setting that mood or setting or environment with the highlight.
Like, Kat, what do you know about this chicken head in terms of the highlights? What is that thing called?
A comb?
A comb?
Oh,
the comb of the chicken?
I call it the flippy flappy.
Yeah.
So based on how the highlights are falling on the comb, Kat, how would you imagine that comb would feel if you were to touch it?
I imagine it would feel dimply or porous. I also think it would be, maybe I'm just like projecting because I kind of know how it would feel like, but it kind of, it definitely wouldn't feel like metal. Like it would have some like fleshy softness to it.
So lighting is not just defining form, but it defines texture and really the character of the form that we are looking at. Ikwe says, do you think the more rigid the fold is the higher the intensity of the light and the more the middle tone disappears? Alex, what do you think?
I think when thinking of folds, if I understand your question right, then yeah, I think that's a really good example of how they work. Think of it almost like a piece of paper instead of a piece of fabric, where if you fold it directly in half and have light shining on one side is going to be full on light, the other in shadow. Now, if you fold it in 3 folds, you're going to have the area with the direct light, and then an area with a mid-tone, and then the area in shadow behind it. So again, if I'm understanding your question right, then I think that that's actually a really good way to look at it.
Let's talk about wet surfaces, because you know what, you guys? Okay, I love doing portraits, but this is my favorite part to paint in a portrait is that like one speck of light on the eyeball. I feel like I work so hard in the portrait just for that moment. Do any of you guys do that?
Oh,
that's
absolutely.
why we paint.
It's so immensely satisfying, and it really does give the eyeball that like gloss, like you can feel the wetness. But there's also stuff like this where you have like a pond and it's like a bright sunny day and you have these like sparkly things and this Chris Van Allsburg illustration. And these I think are tough because they're almost like caricatures of lighting. Kat, does that make any sense?
Oh yeah, I think that makes total sense because it feels like lighting that's able to be captured through a photograph, if that makes sense. Like there's not a lot of nuance to these stipples of light on the water. They're literally just dots of white, but they're very effective to show the sort of object it's portraying. In this case, it is water, or in other cases, it could be like a glossy eyeball or something like that. But it's a very stark white. And that's probably what you're getting at, Clara, when it's like a caricature of highlight.
Now, what about this, Alex? What's going on here with the highlight?
Okay, for me, translucent highlights are like the best. Like every time I'm sketching a composition, I'm like, but is there a way I can put like translucent fabric in front of that light source? It's so much fun. I think that it's a way to kind of mute the lighting, and you're not so much worried at the cast light or the highlights that light source makes so much as how they're directed within that translucency.
I feel like it's magical, isn't it? It's
Mhm.
like, I don't know, fish as a stained glass window. It's just like it doesn't get more elegant
Great,
than that.
great album title, I'd imagine. But yeah, like it's, I think that it's one of those things where it's hard to talk about in just value, but for color, I think it makes a huge difference. Like through the translucent shade, all of the light has the color of what it's shining through.
Mm.
I mean, Kat, I wonder, do you find translucent surfaces like this extra difficult to do?
You mean in terms of drawing with black and white ink, right? Which is
Oh,
what I
well, I
always
don't know, whatever media, because translucency, it really is like an effect. Like,
Mhm.
I almost feels like some cool filter that you put on through Photoshop that, like, boom, it looks all mysterious and ethereal and elegant. I don't know. I love translucency.
Oh yeah. No, I love translucency too, but it's kind of funny. Anytime I think about, oh, I have to portray this kind of thing, I always think, oh, how would I do it in black and white ink? What kind of techniques do I have to do to make this fancy effect? But I do agree, translucency is just it's magical. And actually there are like statues where, master sculptors make like a gossamer veil across a face somehow through
Mhm.
marble, and they have that translucent effect, and you're like, that's crazy. You're not real.
Okay, and then also we saw a little hint of this earlier in the still life, but when you have highlights that are coming from behind something, and sometimes what they're coming from behind are even a little bit translucent, like these clouds. So what's happening here in the scene, Alex?
I think what comes to mind when I think images where the light is coming from behind something and forming it is that narrative element that approaches it. Of course, we can all think of the motivational poster that narratively comes from sunshine coming from behind the storm clouds. But I think it can always be used visually to tell that story and to emphasize the viewer's vision through the piece as they want it to. For here, because you can show both the brightest bright of the light itself, but also the cool, interesting shadows that are formed from transparency.
Kat, if you were to assign a mood to this particular lighting situation, how would you describe the mood that the highlight is making?
Ooh, I think I would describe it as grand or maybe even holy, but maybe it's also because it's clouds, so I'm like, I can't think of anything else. But there's something very dramatic about highlight coming through something. It's like it can be as dramatic as coming through clouds, but it can also be soft and subtle, like coming through cloth. There is some sort of mood and storytelling going beyond just this is fabric and this is cloud. No, suddenly you have a story.
John Murph is saying, I want to paint more realistically than cartoonish. How can lighting make my painting more
Mm.
lifelike? What might you recommend when combining multiple images that come from different directions? Alex, why don't you take this one?
I'd say it's surprisingly easiest method, despite the extra work involved, is making a miniature model. Because you can gather all the photo references you want, but I can't tell you the amount of times I've done that and then been tripped up at the end because the photo references, of course, have a different light source. So even though it seems like so much extra time, it's really not a lot. And the model can be as simple as getting some erasers or modeling clay and just arranging the lighting. It doesn't have to be so precise like some of these amazing models you see. I'd say that's the best way to get consistent lighting.
I mean, you don't even have to sculpt something. Just get like your kid's Barbie doll, or I don't know. I mean, you can use like stuff from a dollhouse. Like any
Yeah. Mhm.
substitute is fine. It does not have to be so specific. So that's another argument, I think. Shoot your own photos, you guys. I know it feels like, oh, that's so much work, but it's like when you have a good reference photo and the lighting is working, oh my God, it's so much easier to deal with. Okay, so let's talk about lighting as part of the subject matter and how lighting can help tell a story. So the first artist we're going to take a look at is Rowe. So Alex, can you tell us how Rowe uses lighting in the artwork and why it plays a role in terms of the story?
Mhm. So Moreau was a French illustrator who did a lot of biblical and mythology-based themes, and Light, this is what we were talking about before with the tables, the kitchen table series. Light is a character in his work. And he does borrow a little bit from Caravaggio's elements, where in pictures of Christ that Caravaggio painted, Christ was both the highlight and the light source, which was a very cool narrative element he included. And Gustave here is mimicking a lot of those same ideas, where the light is always that icon of that character.
Like, Kat, what's going on in this landscape in terms of the lighting and the narrative?
Clearly, it is a very specific time of day, probably sunset. And the light is really highlighting the figures on the bottom right. And then from seeing those figures, you can sort of lead your eye to the left, where it's this like ship. So light can be a character, as Alex said, but light can also help with the composition and to help guide your eye through the piece.
I think just knowing the time of day, that's a hugely important part of telling a story. Like if you have a picture like this seems like bright daytime, but let's say you turn it into a night scene. It's not the same story anymore. And so just as a marker of what time of day it is, I think is very helpful to be looking at. Now, lighting can also create a mood. So in addition to like telling you, oh, it's about 12 o'clock, it can also make you feel a certain way. And I think a lot of films are actually really good at doing that. Like you guys ever watch a movie and they start playing the music and the lighting, and you're like, oh man, I'm totally falling for this. You know, you can feel them tugging at the strings and you're like, yes, this is really tragic. Like I could just feel myself being taken over by that. So Kat, this is a movie called Moonlight. Can you tell us why you chose this one to show?
Oh my gosh. Well, Moonlight is just visually breathtaking. And I think that it is a very different process to have highlights of people of color, if that makes sense, to make that particular lighting situation suit the very different tone of skin. But Moonlight does such an excellent job of this. And we see diffuse light, we see harsh light. So in this case, I think this is harsh light. And in this case, it is diffuse light. So between these two images already, the mood is so different. And I think this is also a good example to show that lighting does not have, highlights don't have to be extremely bright. So as you can see from this blue image, on the child, the highlights are in the whites of the eyes. And notice how bright they are. They're not that bright, but they make the image so much more poignant and also sets a mood. Like, this is very intimate, and you don't need a dramatic highlight to do that.
I think a lot of it is about intent, because this image that we just looked at, the value range is not that broad. I mean, it's pretty dark. You don't get that like bright highlight in there, but you can see from the scene that wasn't an accident. It's not like, oh, they didn't set the camera just settings correctly. It's like they really wanted to have such low contrast because it makes the film feel slower. It's not one of those like MTV editing, like, you know, when they're like flipping it every 2 seconds, well, less than 2 seconds. So Alex, what's happening here in terms of color and light?
This is so stellar how it's making it work, because if you watch our streams on complementary colors especially, you see how much that can do for composition, storytelling, and setting the mood. And now the question always comes, I think, like for me when I was learning color after learning value, was wait, how do you combine the two? This is exactly how, where you look at the blue and the yellows, the blue light coming in and then the yellow reflected light on the other side of his face is awesome. Combined with the blue window on that side and then the yellow wall on the other side. Like, it's really doing everything to make an otherwise fairly neutral scene value-wise really exciting color-wise.
Brian is saying, I always thought warm colors should be used for highlights and cool colors to contrast. Really, Brian, it just depends on the type of lighting. For example, if you have fluorescent light, that's artificial. Fluorescent light is very cold and very sterile. It's probably going to make a cool highlight with warm shadows. Now, a typical incandescent light, it usually has a yellowish tint to it. So you'll have a yellowish highlight with probably like a cooler shadow. So I would say it's more about the lighting type, natural light versus artificial light. That usually determines the color scheme. I don't know, Kat, do you think that's true, or am I missing something?
No, yeah, I think that's true. It's also important to recognize that just in general, lights can be different colors. Like there is blue light, there's also orange light and red light and yellow light, pink light, everything. And normally, whatever color the light is, the shadow is the opposite color. So in this case, this is actually pretty red. um, but normally, if you have an orange light, you would have more of a blue shadow, like what we saw previously, or a blue light with an orange shadow, vice versa.
If it's easier for you guys to think about it in terms of warm and cool. So if you have a cool highlight, you probably have a warm shadow, and vice versa. Thank you so much, Natalie, for the super chat. We greatly appreciate your support. Anything you guys can contribute to help out Art Prof is so helpful in terms of keeping our content 100% free and available to everybody. Okay, we're going to take a look at Mark Tansey, one of my favorite artists. And sometimes if you guys have trouble understanding lighting, it really helps just to go monochromatic, because then you're not distracted by all the, warm, cool, blue, orange. That can be overwhelming if you're feeling like, I don't really know what's going on. And I like Mark Tansey's work because, first of all, lighting is a huge part of his storytelling, but also he does sometimes just use one color. So there is this extra pop to this image because it's this bright turquoise color, and they have this like eerie tint to them that you don't really get when you have black and white. So, for example, Alex, how does the light work in this story?
This is my favorite image on this slideshow, bar none, because it's the opening. It's that beautiful stage opening is what I get of it, and you have this glimpse of the actors behind it. So the lighting, this is that kind of drama, like the light coming from behind the clouds. It's that anticipation of that light source, the crowd being opened up onto the stage. And it's that character is doing so much for it.
And Kat, can you talk about this image? Because in this one, we can visibly see the light source. It's a flashlight, and it's casting this very dramatic shadow. So how do we talk about that it's a flashlight? Like, how does that affect the story?
Well, anytime I think, there's flashlight light, it has to be a spooky story. Like you're going to be bottom lit and there's a flashlight on your face. That's automatically what I think of. But I also think there's sort of like a discovery to flashlights. So flashlights, of course, you're going to have a very harsh light. You're going to focus on that light as well, but it's also going to highlight whatever it is shining upon. So there's an element of discovery with this piece using the flashlight light.
Thank you so much to RB Dick for the super sticker. We greatly appreciate your support. Thank you, everybody, so much for that. Okay, so Kat, tell us about Mizuki and how they use highlights.
Oh, I'm such a fan of Shigeru Mizuki, especially his yokai illustration, his I guess Japanese monster demon illustrations, because he uses light so effectively in these very stark black and white pieces. So previously we saw a flashlight, and then now we see flashlight eyes. And I think it's just like wonderful to see the stark flashlight eyes against the sort of faded moon, because usually when we think of the moon, that's going to be the brightest light. I mean, the sun shines on the surface of the moon, of course that's going to be bright, but in this case Mizuki makes it kind of a little bit behind the clouds, a little bit of a translucent light, and highlights the flashlight eyes.
So I mean, these are great examples that a medium like pen and ink, that most people would think, oh, well, that's really hard to show lighting because you can't do shading and stuff like you can with charcoal. You can see that light is definitely part of that language. Like, what's happening here, Alex, in terms of lighting?
This one it's doing a really cool thing where the lighting is becoming, or I should say the highlight is becoming part of the mystery. And it's kind of turning its head on us, the viewer, we're so used to the darks and the shadows being that mysterious area. But here the highlight is becoming this fog and this mysterious place where these creatures are residing.
And I think definitely those old black and white movies, oh man, what would they have done without their lighting people? Because I feel like the lighting in some of these cases, it's the film, is the light. So, Kat, have you seen Citizen Kane? Because I haven't.
Oh my gosh, I actually have not seen Citizen Kane. I don't even know what it's about.
That I like put slides in here and I haven't seen it myself. Tell us in the chat who here has seen Citizen Kane. Come on, confess. Alex, what about you? Because I know you're a big film nerd.
I am, but it's funny. I like to save like good movies that I haven't seen yet for a rainy day because nothing's better than watching a good movie for the first time. Citizen Kane is one of those that I'm just saving. So I technically haven't seen it yet. But it's funny, as these slides show, you don't have to have seen this movie to, one, know its cultural impact, but two, recognize that Orson Welles was, let's use that cliche of like a star behind and in front of the camera, where I've seen many of his other films he stars in and directed, and these show all of the skill he had in setting the mood with the lighting. Like even in those two, where the light source is those same two windows in the back, look at how much the brightness changes the mood and the story within those images.
It's a great way to show that lighting can profoundly shift the scene. Same architecture, but completely different situation.
I want to highlight this question from Ibique. Do abstract works have highlights? I know the rules change a lot when it comes to abstracts. Alex, do you want to take a stab at this question?
That's a really good question. I think it reminds me of when, who was it? Soy Tainley maybe earlier, who was asking about getting their work less cartoony and more realistic. And I think it has the same vibe where you have to know the rules before you can break and or bend them. Where once you know how light can work and once you know how you can direct the eye with it, then you can use it in any way you see fit. But if you're doing an abstract and letting the lights just go willy-nilly, then it'll come off in the final product.
I think it's just you have to treat it differently. It's apples and oranges. Like you can't apply the same rules of Citizen Kane to an abstract painting, but the concept is the same, is that it's high contrast, leads the eye across the page. I think if you stick to those fundamentals, that usually works out pretty well. By the way, this Google slideshow and many of our other slideshows are available. The link is in the YouTube video description below. And we do have these other two videos, Light and Shadow on Portraits, and this other video where we talk specifically about shadows. We do have an art prof share today, which is when one of you guys creates an artwork in reaction to one or several of our videos. So today, the art prof share is by Casey Grangs. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. And Casey actually shared with us two versions. So this is one version of the painting, and this is the second version. And you guys can see if you look at the computer screens, that in the earlier version, the computer screens are a little bit more dim. And here, they really have like a bite to them. Like they really show up dramatically. And so Casey says that they ended up watching this complementary color scheme video. And in the video, we showed this one painting by Hope Gangloff, who's a contemporary painter, as an example of how to successfully use hypersaturated colors. And Casey explains that they also watched our intro to gouache painting, where, of course, Alex, you're raving about Naples yellow instead of using titanium white. What's so great about Naples yellow, Alex?
Especially for a stream like this, I have to stress that Naples yellow is a wonderful highlight color because it's, of course, yellow, but it's not as stark of a warm color to be completely overwhelming, nor is it as bland as a titanium white.
So Casey explains, I submitted two images because I used a sheen called, quote, interference blue, layered over the screens of the laptops from Golden Artist colors. This technique makes the colors and luminescence appear different in different lighting. So Kat, what do you think about these two versions?
Oh my gosh, there's a lot of technicalities behind how Casey was able to change the colors between the two pieces. I think it's so cool to be able to see the difference, especially side by side in the slideshow. It's sort of like before, after. And the difference is really highlighted in this case. But I also think that they do have a bit of a different time of day feeling to them when I first saw them, because when I saw the screens were off, I assumed it was more of like a daylight situation. And when the screens were more highlighted, I thought, oh, this is must be more nighttime because the screens are highlighted, which can only happen in a dark space. So I think that's a super interesting conceptual narrative to have this very interesting scene be shown at different times of day.
I just have to say, in general, it's a great composition. I mean, we've been sort of nailing some of you guys on your composition lately. And I just think the way the laptops are distributed, the upper left-hand corner, the fact that there's a laptop in the lower left-hand corner, and also it's so cool that we can definitely see the inspiration. Like you can see where this comes from, but this is definitely Casey's work. And it's definitely got their individual print on the pieces. So it's a great example of being inspired by somebody, but then twisting it around so that they can make it their own piece. If you guys want to be considered for an Art Prof share, you can go to artprof.org, click on tutorials. And if you click on this purple button, we do have the submission form. So if you guys want to get a shout out, just send us your stuff that way. Or if you guys want to just show us on Instagram, tag us art.prof and use hashtag artprofshare to make sure we can find your work. Art Prof has a podcast. It's available on Spotify and also on iTunes. And in a few minutes, Alex and Kat will be hanging out in the Art Prof Discord in the post live streams channel to chat more. And by the way, Casey is live with us here in the chat. Thank you so much for showing up. We're so happy that we were able to share with everybody some of your creative process. So thank you so much for coming in. Subscribe to our channel so you can continue to grow and develop as an artist. And thank you so much to our top Patreon supporters. Thank you to all of you guys for watching the stream. There's a couple new names on the second slide. It's very exciting. So everybody, thank you so much. We'll see you next time. Bye.